Hello, everyone. My name is Julie Patel Liss. I'm an assistant professor of journalism at Cal State LA. Thank you so much for having me. Today, I'm going to be talking about multimedia journalism or digital journalism. And just to get started, I'm going to go ahead and share with you my screen so you can go ahead and see some of my slides. As for the lineup today, I'm going to talk briefly about who I am. We're going to talk about digital and sort of the power of digital media. And then we're going to talk about, well, how do these digital skills that we can gain through our education or through online seminars or just by practicing digital media, how can they apply to a range of professions and industries? So you can find out more about who I am and what I've done by, reading my LinkedIn bio page or reading this bio over here. I produced journalism for 15 years before I went into teaching. So have quite a bit of experience, but I want to just focus today on the digital aspect of my job. At the Mercury News, for instance, I was covering things like city council meetings, and I started out covering race and demographics, did education, but I did have opportunities to experiment in the digital realm, which was great. We were in Silicon Valley, so it made a lot of sense. When I covered Burning Man for the Mercury News, for instance, not only did I file sort of a feature story and a box sidebar with practical how-to tips, a listicle for print and for the website, a text story. But I also, when I attended Burning Man, I also blogged about it. And, we did, I would say, probably 4 or 5 posts throughout that time. My partner, my colleague did, 4 or 5, and I did 4 or 5 blog posts with photos and just with snippets of what we were hearing, interviews, that kind of thing. And then the following year, I was able to produce a news video about Burning Man. And it was very basic. It was one of the first times I'd shot video or edited video. I was using iMovie, but it was a lot of fun. And then the year after that, I was able to produce a radio piece / podcast for KQED's website. They had a show called Pacific Time about Asian American issues. So I sort of took that, looked at Burning Man through that lens. And moving on to the Sun Sentinel, that's a traditional newspaper, right? We had a website, and at the Sun Sentinel, we ended up starting a business blog. And my partner and I did the House Keys. It was called the House Keys blog on property insurance and real estate issues. And it was hugely successful. Very, very popular. It was one of the most well-read blogs at the time at the Sun Sentinel. And even though it was about business issues, which seemed like they may, insurance is not the most glamorous issue, and yet it really affected people's lives in Florida because of all the hurricanes and problems getting insurance. And so that gave me a chance to experiment. I was able to, when sinkholes data came out, I was able to map the sinkholes using mapping software. And, if I had to produce visuals, and I was able to do that on the blog. So it gave me some really good experience in digital. And so then by the time I got to WAMU, which is, an NPR affiliate in DC, I was able to sort of use some of the data visualization skills when we produced our stories about our Deals for Developers series. And the same was true at the Center for Public Integrity. So that's kind of a snapshot of what I've done and how I've done it. And I'd like to move on and just dive right into the material. So starting with talking about why digital media is so important. If you think about it, it's the future of journalism, of course. Our audiences, especially those under 50, are primarily online at this unique time where we are all stuck at home, working remotely, and just staying indoors. Digital media is even more important, even for those folks who are over 50, right? Like they may not be getting the hard copy of their magazine or their newspaper, and so digital media is even more important right now. But it's going to continue being more important as our generations of digital native folks primarily or only really consume media through the web. And really, as a platform, it is unparalleled because it allows us to do so many things. So for instance, it's, to use sort of a mass media term, it's compatible, right? It allows us to combine text and photos and audio and video and graphics. all at the same time, all on the same place, right, on the same page, and interchangeably. So this is very unique. It's also mobile. We can access it with our phones anytime, any place. It's also interactive, and therefore it's engaging. People, are not just staring at a screen like they do in a movie theater, right? And just taking in the messages from the media without really being able to interact with it. On the web, at the very least, you're pushing a button, the play button or the pause or the rewind. And often it's a lot more. You're playing with data, as you can see on the screen here. You're able to see movement. You're able to make things move. You're able to expand things, right? You're able to get more information about certain parts of that page. And so it makes for having great conversations. The journalists are communicating with their audience a lot more, and it's not a one-way flow of communication. It's two ways. We're learning, what the audience is telling us is often shaping the stories that we tell. Digital media is just wonderful in so many ways, not least that it gives us a more democratic way of producing the news. And when it comes to digital, the nice thing is that we have many choices. And really how well we execute our stories depends on the choices that we make. If you want to be an effective digital storyteller, you have to sort of weigh each story that you want to tell individually and decide what is the best treatment for that online, right? And so I have a few general rules to help you assess sort of the medium and, the various multimedia elements that might go with the story to help you pick sort of what platform you're going to use or what elements you're going to produce. So for instance, if you know that the story is a very sound-rich story, right? You're covering a concert, for instance, and so there's beautiful music that you can incorporate into the piece, then obviously you definitely want to consider audio, right? Maybe you just want to do a podcast for your news site and you're going to skip the video or the text story altogether. And sometimes you do you write a very compelling narrative story, which, you're telling a story, you're developing the characters. There's some sort of plot that unfolds and some sort of resolution that comes about. And so if it's a rich story like that, then you may do the text story, and write it in a very compelling way, kind of like a page turner, right? But then you may also decide, as two newspapers did in recent years, to turn that narrative story into a podcast. And those examples are the San Jose Mercury News, where I used to work in the beginning of my career. They did a story, really compelling story, about a 10-year-old boy who basically ended up hanging himself. He was found hung in a barn at his house. And so this reporter had, gone back and tried to figure out, well, what really happened in this case? They never, there was this feeling they never quite got to the bottom of it. So, and that perhaps it was not a suicide, of such a young boy. And so this very compelling series of stories, then the Mercury News turned it into a podcast. And similarly, you've probably heard of Dirty John. Dirty John was actually an LA Times narrative piece about a man who sort of swindles women, women in Southern California. And this was, again, a very compelling narrative that the LA Times turned into a podcast. And of course, now it's a Netflix TV show. So you can see sort of, if you have a great story, there's a lot you can do with it. And sometimes it may start as one medium on one platform, but you may find compelling uses on other platforms as well. And that's why it helps. I mean, you never know what's really going to happen with a story. So even if you're planning on it being a text story, it's always a good idea to get the recording, and that way you're able to transform it into another medium if needed, if it ends up being a really great story. In terms of other ways of breaking down how to decide your platform. Obviously, if you have really strong visuals, really strong photos and really strong, video content and maybe some good sound as well, video is the choice there, right? Like you would really want to produce a news video, or if you have a lot of content and a longer story, then maybe a longer news video piece, like a documentary. My partner and I Di Sugano, a photojournalist at the San Jose Mercury News, we decided to produce a documentary. And the way we came about that decision is I had written a quick story for the paper and for the website about a mobile home park in Sunnyvale, California, in the Silicon Valley, that was being shuttered in order to make way for single family homes. This was during the housing boom, and so this was not just happening in Sunnyvale and in the San Francisco Bay Area, but really all across California and even other states, because the demand for housing was such that, if some of these mobile home parks were built in prime locations near hospitals, near public transit, near, jobs and rec centers and senior centers. And so, developers were taking over this prime real estate and building higher priced housing. And so it started with a story about that. And I'm just going to go ahead and read the lead briefly to you so you get an idea of what the story's about. When Javier Ortiz moved to Flick's mobile home park in Sunnyvale last year, after the one he lived in had been shuttered to make way for single-family homes, he jokingly asked Flick's manager, "You aren't going to close too, are you?" He hadn't even unpacked some of his boxes when he got the letter in early November. The park could indeed close. "I couldn't believe it was happening again," he said. And so that's basically, let's not skip ahead. That's basically the story that launched us on this nearly year-long journey to document the lives of these residents. And, I ended up interviewing probably 12 or 13 different residents before we found two that were compelling and that we would decide to sort of focus on, that would really work for a documentary. And those folks were, one was the woman pictured in the previous slide, Marilyn Baker, and the other family was Luis Trujeke and his daughter, Manelia. And so by the end of this 9-10 month long process, this is sort of the story we produced, and I'll show you a snippet of the documentary in a minute, but here's part of the text story. The treatment that we used was online. We had the text story with just a couple photos. In print, we had the text story and, I believe it was like a whole page or maybe even 2 pages of photos, because the images were very compelling, and this is why we went with the documentary, right? As Di Sugano, an award-winning photojournalist, he has a very artistic way of looking at the world, and it made sense to go with this. And so the text story that we ended up running with the video really focused on Marilyn Baker. So I'm just going to go ahead and read that. "There couldn't have been a worse time for Marilyn Baker to get the letter. Her son was fighting cancer, and her husband and other son had died 2 years before that. It seemed she had just enough energy to make her kidney dialysis appointments several times a week and attend to simple household chores. Bewildered, she read and reread the thing. Flick's mobile home park, her home for the past 26 years, was going to be sold. That meant the Sunnyvale Park would close. It meant the 77-year-old would have to pick up and move. Where would she go? How would she sort through a lifetime of belongings? Would her friends at the park all be scattered? All these thoughts come to you as you're reading this," Baker said. So that gives you an idea of the story. Now that we have a little bit of setup, I'm going to show you a snippet of the video, and you kind of have a sense of Marilyn's story, but in the video, the video snippet we're going to watch is about the other family that we profiled, which is Luis Trujeke and his daughter. So you can see Marilyn and Luis, they live side by side in these 2 trailers. Okay, Marilyn's is on the right and Luis's is on the left.
Like, you want some white rice? Yeah, just a little. It's your own place. We thought it was like our own place. We never thought that they were gonna like kick us out so soon. But
Okay, so I think that sufficiently gives you an idea of the kind of video we could produce when, you have the reporter interviewing the sources and getting as much information as possible, and Dai is sitting there just going at it with his camera, right? I mean, he's getting so much compelling content, visual content, and so we really had a lot to work with. So that's kind of one example of the kind of news video you can produce. And of course, like, our documentary was 23 minutes, but you really, many stories, most stories only really need a minute or two. And so you can maybe tell your story very quickly and compellingly through a quick news video, get some footage of showing kind of what you're talking about. And if you don't have enough visuals, enough of those great photos or videos, you can always consider adding animation, as is the case in this New York Times piece, which I've trimmed to just kind of highlight and focus on the animations. That, there's a lot you can do with animation when you need animation to fill in spaces, fill in parts of your video that don't have good visuals, right? Because you want to make sure you're matching what you're saying to the video. And so, you will have a lot of, stills or B-roll, they call it, video footage of something happening that you're talking about. But when you need to fill in the gaps, you can use infographics or charts, data, or animations such as this, which can be made, in After Effects and in other products. And, speaking of animation, animation can actually be used to make your information more informative and more interactive. And so I want to give you one more example, and this is again from the New York Times. It's another New York Times opinion piece, and this one is about voter suppression. So rather than just doing a text story, talking about the problems with voter suppression and, incorporating all their research into that story, they decided to take all the research that they did about various states and various demographics and turn it into a video game to tell the story. And it's done in a very compelling way. And, you don't see very much of this still. I mean, this was a few years ago, but I'm hoping that you'll see more and more of this, because this can make for very engaging, interesting content and informative content. You learn a lot by, through this piece. So we're going to watch a little bit of this. And I highly encourage you to, when we're done with the session, to go and look it up yourself and play the game yourself, and you'll come out with different outcomes. So basically, this is the voter suppression trail, and it's, find out if your vote can survive the great flawed adventure of American democracy. And very fittingly, they end up using the Oregon Trail as sort of the theme music. You get the idea, and I would highly recommend that you look this one up and just play it on your own. Maybe you won't pick the Latina nurse from Texas. Maybe you'll pick one of the other ones, but just go for it and try it out yourself. A ranking or a list, or maybe if it's a how-to story and it's in steps, then, or maybe you have a photo slideshow, and so that's sort of like you have, almost like a list of content items, right? Photo caption. Then you could consider doing a listicle. Listicles are very popular online, and sometimes you'll see them as like 10 ways to improve your cat's lifespan, or 5 things you should know about da da da. These work very well online. And let me show you a couple of examples of that. One of our student journalists produced, Martha Nerio, she produced a story about the 8 oddities of sorority life. Just some, bizarre, unique things that the sororities on our campus do that most people don't know about. And so she did that, and that was, very successful online. Another example from my own career is I did a story about the money that super PACs, basically political action committees, the money that they were spending from donors that wasn't actually going to supporting or opposing a candidate. It was going to things like swanky hotel stays and eating at these fine dining establishments. One of the story elements of the story was a photo slideshow with just kind of like snarky captions about each of these places that they had spent money on. And so that can be kind of a way to break up the story and just make it more digestible online. Sometimes we're not doing stories that are necessarily easily digestible, that are just like quick hits, like a nice little like listicle, or quick little video. Sometimes, and this is kind of a lot of the work that I do, it's like hard hitting, deep investigative journalism that requires a lot of in-depth reporting and a lot of backup, a lot of support, right? Because you're claiming these like pretty strong things that people are doing. You're revealing something, often that's people are not supposed to be doing, right? So you really have to back it up with a lot of statistics. And when you have stories like that, I mean, the worst thing you can do is just have text. Because if any of you have read stories like that online, it's really easy to get distracted by other things happening in your life and online, or maybe you get a notification on your phone, or you get the ding from an email, and often you will not finish reading that. The best way to handle that is to really make it multimedia. Yes, you're going to have the text element, but maybe you'll use pull quotes to break up the text a little bit. Maybe you'll use bullet lists, like a mini little listicle, right, somewhere on the side or in the middle of the story. Maybe you have great images that can break up the story. Maybe you have snapshots of documents that you were able to obtain, and you can show sort of those documents in parts of the story. Data graphics are really important. For my IRS project at the Center for Public Integrity, I was tasked with looking into the IRS and a tip about whether they had really stopped cracking down on so-called dark money nonprofits that basically are still supposed to serve the public good, and yet many of them had been used to support political candidates and to sway elections, right? And rather than doing what their main mission, which is to serve everyone and serve the social good or the public good. As part of that investigation, which ran on the center's website, but also NBC News, we really had to break the story up in a lot of different ways to tell the real story. The real story was that the IRS over decades, but also in recent years, their resources had been slashed to the point where they were having trouble doing their basic duties that they're supposed to do, which is cracking down on nonprofits that are not meeting that mission, and instead doing what they're not supposed to be doing, which is politicking and trying to influence elections. So the way we did the story, you can just kind of see what the story looked like online. Of course, plenty of pull quotes and sidebars to help kind of tell the story. And then, as I mentioned, bullet lists to break up our findings. Like, these are all the different things we found. Data charts that show, every one of these charts showed that the resources were going down. The number of crackdowns, the number of applications that were denied were decreasing. The number of audits that they were doing were decreasing. The only chart that was going up was the amount that dark money nonprofits were spending on elections. So you saw that at the very end. We had a few photos and they worked to break it up a little bit, but this was not a very visual story. The timeline really helped because we had a lot of great history and context for how this had happened over the years, but that would be way too much text in a story. So making it interactive in a timeline really helped tell the story, in a way that was more compelling. So you have all these digital skills. Now, what do you do with them? Well, I'm here to tell you there is a lot you can do with them. I mean, almost every industry and every profession in that industry requires some level of digital know-how. Certainly media companies, not just news companies, but other types of media and entertainment companies, they need people to do all of these skills that we gain as digital journalists, the writing, the shooting, the editing, the reporting, the performing skills, the production, the back end engineering and web production, right? The web design, the graphics, the illustration, all that great artwork that's required, coding and programming. And certainly non-media companies need all these skills as well. But the reason these skills are needed for most industries is, well, think about it. Like if you work at a major company, or you own it, or you help manage that company, or it can be a nonprofit or a government agency as well, you need to know how to market the product or the service to customers, right? You need to know how to deal with customers and how to interact and engage with them and really get them excited about something and really have a conversation with them and get their feedback, and how to build community as well as goodwill through social media, through a website, through videos, and telling a compelling story about your product or about your nonprofit. And so many of these skills that we learn in journalism, just doing digital work, will come in handy in so many other professions. And that's why you see, I've had friends who are journalists who go on to work for companies like Facebook. One of my colleagues at Stanford, he went on to do journalism for a while, and then he went and he worked for Facebook, right, doing their PR and communication. We had a former colleague at the San Jose Mercury News who went on to be basically the director of a zoo. And there are countless examples like that. So digital skills are really in demand. Thank you so much for listening and participating. I really appreciate it. I'm so sorry that this had to be pre-recorded, so I really couldn't ask you questions and hear from you. But if you do have any questions, I would strongly encourage you to get in touch. I'm on Twitter and LinkedIn at Julie Patel, on Instagram and Facebook, Julie V. Patel. And I want to give a huge thank you to Marisol Zarate, my former student at Fullerton College. It's been so nice catching up with you, Marisol, by email and just through this whole process. Thank you for inviting me. Dr. Ari Posner, thank you so much for having me. And all the organizers of Cal State Fullerton's ComWeek program, thank you for making this happen. This is a great event, and I hope to share some of the other speakers' videos with my students. So thank you very much. Take care, and please hit me up with any questions.